My name is Grace Anderson, and at 62 years old, I never thought I would be telling this story. The kind of story that begins like a dream and ends like a storm breaking over a quiet sea. I was born in a small Ohio town, the daughter of a factory worker and a school teacher. Raised in a house where faith and hard work were considered twin pillars of survival. I married young, lost that marriage to time and differences, and raised two children who are grown now with families of their own. For years I lived quietly, teaching part-time, tending my garden, volunteering at the library, convincing myself that solitude was safety, that wanting more was selfish at my age. Yet, deep down, there was a soft hunger for companionship, for the warmth of being seen again, and it was that hunger that left me open the day I met Leonard Hayes. He was 65, a widower with silver hair, and a voice that carried the calm authority of a man used to being listened to. He found me at a community fundraiser, where he pressed a glass of punch into my hand and asked me about the book I was holding, as though he truly cared. His laughter was deep, disarming, and he spoke of losing his wife in a way that was tender but not bitter, as though grief had polished him instead of broken him. I was not naive, not anymore, but when he began to call me his future, when his eyes softened in candlelight and his hand pressed mine across restaurant tables, I let myself believe that perhaps, after so many years of standing alone, I had finally been chosen again. He made me feel like the final chapter of my life could be written not in loneliness, but in partnership, that the empty spaces in my house and my heart could be filled with laughter and purpose. I told myself it was never too late to find love, never too late to risk trust, even if my children rolled their eyes and said I should be cautious. Leonard spoke about buying a house together, about traveling, about blending our lives into something new, and each word wrapped around me like a promise I wanted to hold on to. Looking back now, I see the subtle shadows, the pauses, the guarded phone calls I ignored. But in that season, all I wanted was to be loved. To be called someone's future after being overlooked for so long felt like water in a desert. And I drank deeply without asking if the cup was clean. It began as a whisper in my mind. The kind of whisper you try to smother with reason. But it grows louder each time you ignore it, until it echoes through everything you do. At first, Leonard seemed almost too perfect, a man who remembered the details of my day, who never failed to compliment the color of my dress or the way I styled my hair, who spoke in long, steady lines about forever, as though it were as simple as setting a date on the calendar. Yet I noticed things, small at first, the kind of things you dismiss when you want to believe in someone. His phone would buzz late at night, and he would turn it face down on the table as though it were nothing, smiling quickly to distract me with some story about the years he spent restoring his sailboat. Once, when I reached for his hand as he ended a call, his palm was damp with sweat, though his expression was calm. I told myself I was imagining it, that perhaps age had made me paranoid, that after being alone so long I was sabotaging my own chance at happiness by searching for cracks in something good. But the unease settled inside me like a stone. He asked about my pension one evening, not casually, but with the kind of precision that made me pause. How much was it worth? When did I draw from it? Was it locked in or flexible? He framed it as curiosity, as concern for our shared future, but it felt like an audit rather than love. Then came the questions about my house, whether it was in my name alone, whether I had considered downsizing, whether I ever thought of selling. I laughed them off, telling myself that couples planning a future discuss practical matters, that it was a sign of seriousness. Still, something gnawed at me. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, trying to decide if my heart was foolish or my instincts were wise. I tried to bury the doubts, telling myself that loneliness was tricking me into suspicion, that if I questioned him, I would ruin the fragile happiness we had begun to build. I wanted so desperately to hold on to the warmth of his attention, to stay wrapped in the illusion of being chosen, that I swallowed my fears and let the silence grow heavier, a silence that pressed against me like a weight I could neither lift nor confess. That night, I could not sleep, my mind restless with the unease I had been burying for weeks, and the silence of my bedroom felt heavier than the darkness pressing at the windows. Leonard had drifted into the slow breathing of deep sleep beside me, his phone resting carelessly on the nightstand, glowing briefly with each vibration as though it were taunting me with secrets. I told myself not to look, that good women trusted, that snooping was a sin of mistrust, but my heart pounded so fiercely that my hands trembled as I reached for it. One swipe opened the screen, and there it was. A conversation that made the air leave my lungs as if I had been struck. Line after line spilled across the glass. Words he had written to a friend. Words that mocked me. Words that reduced me to a calculation. "She's easy money," he had typed. Followed by a crude laugh. I could hear in my mind the very same laugh he once used to charm me. My savings, my pension, the home I had spent decades paying off with the sweat of my work, were discussed like spoils waiting to be claimed. "Her nest egg will set me up nice," one message read. And another, more cutting than all the rest. "She thinks she's my future, but she's my ticket." My chest tightened so hard I thought I might cry out and wake him, but the tears froze, somewhere deep inside, replaced by a stillness sharper than grief. Every memory of his tender words replayed with new edges. Every touch now felt like a theft disguised as affection. I scrolled, my hands trembling, reading how he joked that women like me were desperate for love and easy to lead, how he had reassured his friend that I would never suspect a thing. Shame burned through me, but beneath it, another fire stirred, slow and steady, a fire I had not felt in years. I placed the phone back on the table, careful not to stir him, and lay on my side with my eyes wide open, staring into the blackness. Sleep would not come, not now, not ever again in the way it once had. I realized in that moment that the future he promised was a mirage, and I was standing on its dry and cracked ground, holding nothing but the bitter truth. The breaking point did not come like a scream or a storm. It came like ice, spreading through my veins as I read those messages again and again, until the words blurred but the meaning cut sharper with every glance. Leonard was not dreaming of a life with me. He was constructing a ledger, calculating a payout, turning my years of sacrifice into numbers he thought he could pocket with ease. The man who kissed my forehead and whispered promises of growing old together was the same man who reduced me to a balance sheet in private, mocking my trust as though it were a weakness instead of a gift. My hands shook as I held the phone, my throat tight with the weight of betrayal, and yet inside me a strange clarity began to rise, cold and sharp as glass. For years I had been cautious, too careful, convincing myself that confrontation was not my nature, that silence was safer. But in that moment, my silence cracked like a brittle shell, and I knew something inside me had shifted forever. I placed the phone back on the table, as though setting down a weapon, my heart pounding, my breath shallow, and for a moment I watched him sleep, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a man who believed he had already won. My love for him dissolved into something heavier, something harder, not grief alone, but a fury so still it frightened me. I did not cry, though I thought I would, and I did not scream, though the urge clawed at my throat. Instead, I lay back and let the fury settle into my bones, a silent companion that sharpened my mind in ways I had forgotten were possible. It was as though every betrayal I had endured, every dismissal, Every time I had been told to be grateful for scraps of affection had gathered together in that moment, rising in me like a tide that could no longer be held back. I understood then that Leonard's game was not just about money. It was about power, about taking from me the dignity I had built over a lifetime. But he had underestimated me, underestimated the strength that grows in a woman who has weathered loss and carried burdens alone. He thought I was an easy mark, but I was about to become his reckoning. The morning after I discovered the truth, I rose from bed as if nothing had changed, though in reality, everything had been shattered and rebuilt into something unrecognizable inside me. Leonard stirred, smiled at me with that familiar, practiced warmth, and kissed my cheek as though his lips could erase the filth of his words from the night before. And I let him believe it worked. I brewed the coffee, scrambled the eggs, and asked him about his errands with the same softness I had always shown. But behind my eyes, the stage had been reset. I became an actress, playing the part of the doting partner, nodding when he spoke of the vacations we would take and the home improvements we might make, while privately cataloguing every sentence, every slip, every glance at his phone that seemed too long. I began to keep notes, at first scribbled quickly on scraps of paper in my purse, then later neatly organized in a small notebook I kept hidden beneath the lining of my dresser drawer. Dates, times, the exact wording of his questions about my accounts, even the way his tone shifted when I hesitated, all of it recorded with a precision I did not know I still possessed. I taught myself how to take screenshots, quietly transferring them to a USB drive, tucked away behind jars of preserves in my pantry. A secret cache of truth, waiting for the right moment. Each entry was like placing a brick in a wall I was building between his lies and my survival, each detail another nail in the coffin of the future he thought he controlled. In his presence, I laughed when he made jokes, touched his hand across the table, and leaned into him, as though I were still wrapped in the glow of his affection. But in my mind I stood apart, observing him with the cool detachment of a witness preparing testimony. It was not easy, for my heart still carried the bruises of what I had read. But I learned to wear a mask of serenity, to swallow my anger and let it ripen into resolve. There was a quiet power in pretending, in letting him believe he had fooled me, even as I gathered the very evidence that would undo him. With every meal I served, every kiss I returned, I sharpened my silence into a weapon he would never see coming. I walked into the bank with my chin held steady, my palms damp inside my gloves, and the same quiet determination I used to carry into parent-teacher conferences when my children were small and someone dared to underestimate them. The marble floor gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, and the air carried that faint, sterile scent of ink and paper, a place where trust and betrayal were recorded in tidy columns. I requested my statements in a low voice, feeling as though every teller and every customer could see through me, could guess that the smiling man I arrived with at church luncheons was in fact the shadow I was chasing. The clerk handed me the stack of pages with a polite smile, and I slipped them into my purse before retreating to the safety of my car. It was there, in the quiet of the driver's seat, that I unfolded the papers and began to trace the pattern of my life, reduced to debits and credits. The numbers at first looked ordinary, the expected rhythm of groceries, utility bills, modest donations. But then the oddities began to appear like stains bleeding through fabric, withdrawals that matched the nights Leonard had urged me to take out cash for some vague emergency, transfers that aligned with his sudden talk of fixing the car or paying off a bill he claimed was overdue. I remembered his soothing voice assuring me that it was only temporary, that he would handle it, that love meant trust, and I saw now how those words had been nothing but locks he placed on my common sense. My chest tightened as I added the totals, the sum climbing higher than I wanted to believe, evidence that I was not his partner but his account, carefully prodded and drained under the cover of affection. Rage flared hot in me. But behind it came a clarity sharper than any blade. The paper in my hands was not just a statement of loss, it was proof, cold and undeniable. And it carried more weight than any of his rehearsed denials ever could. I folded the sheets neatly, placed them back into the envelope, and tucked them beside the USB drive at home, another piece of the puzzle I was assembling in silence. He thought I was blind, but now I had eyes wide open, and I would not let him steal one more dollar or one more day from me. It happened over dinner on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of evening where the smell of roasted chicken lingered in the air, and the soft light of the lamp made everything seem warmer than it truly was, when Leonard leaned back in his chair, glass of wine in hand, and said with a casual authority that we ought to merge our finances now, since we would be marrying soon. The words hung in the air, heavy as stones, and I forced a small smile, tilting my head as if considering, though inside my pulse hammered with a dread I did not show. I told him gently that I needed time, that I wanted to think it over, not out of distrust but out of caution, because I had been careful all my life and could not simply unlearn that habit. For the first time, the smooth mask of charm he wore so easily cracked, and the edge of irritation in his eyes flashed sharp and cold. His jaw tightened as he reminded me how much he had done for me, how he had given me hope again, how love required trust, repeating the word trust as though it were a cudgel meant to break me down. I watched him carefully, and in that moment I caught my first glimpse of the real man beneath the polished exterior, a man whose patience was not patience at all but performance, a man whose generosity was a down payment on control. His voice lost its softness, became clipped, almost mechanical. And though he caught himself and tried to recover with a laugh, the damage was already done. I tucked the moment away in the private archive I was building, another page in the ledger of truth that only I held. Outwardly, I nodded and reached across the table to squeeze his hand, pretending to be reassured, letting him believe that his show of dominance had gone unnoticed, but inwardly my resolve hardened like cooling steel. I realized then that the life I thought he was offering me was not love, but possession, that his promises of forever were only chains he intended to fasten tighter with every concession I made. The flicker of his true self was brief, but it was enough to strip away the illusion, enough to tell me that if I gave him control once, I would never reclaim it. I knew I could not carry the weight of what I had uncovered alone. And so, one chilly afternoon, I drove across town to see Elaine Porter, an old friend whose sharp mind had once been a force in the courtroom before she retired. Elaine had always been a woman of substance, the kind of person who spoke with a calm authority that made even the most tangled problems seem manageable. And when I sat across from her at her kitchen table, with the scent of peppermint tea rising between us, I finally let the words spill out. I told her everything, from the late-night messages to the careful probing about my pension, to the withdrawals I had traced, and the mask that had slipped when he pushed me to merge our finances. She listened without interrupting, her brows knitting, her eyes narrowing not with disbelief, but with anger carefully contained. When I finished, she leaned forward and said in a voice so steady it rooted me to the chair, "You are not weak, Grace. You are holding the cards." She explained the steps I needed to take, the quiet moves that would protect me without alerting Leonard. Freeze certain accounts, move others into a trust with my children named as secondary beneficiaries, and continue documenting everything. She reminded me that the law did not just belong to the bold or the rich, that it was a tool for women like me who had spent a lifetime being told to be grateful and silent. As she laid out her advice, her words felt like stones building a wall around me. A fortress I had not realized I could claim for myself. I felt a flicker of hope where only dread had lived, as though she had handed me a lantern in a tunnel I thought would never end. I clasped her hand across the table, the same hand that had once signed verdicts and settlement papers, and I felt her strength pass into me. When I drove home that evening, the winter sky streaked pink and grey. I no longer felt like prey, hiding in the shadows of Leonard's schemes. I felt like a strategist, quietly moving pieces across a board he did not even know existed, waiting for the moment when I would reveal the checkmate he never saw coming. I had rehearsed the moment in my mind so many times that when it finally came, it felt almost theatrical, as if the room itself were holding its breath, waiting for the curtain to rise. The table was set simply: roasted chicken, a bottle of red wine breathing in its glass, and Leonard sitting across from me with that polished ease that once charmed me, but now looked like a mask painted too carefully. He raised his glass and spoke about our shared future, his words dripping with false warmth, and I let my lips curve into a smile as though I were still under his spell. My hand moved slowly, deliberately, sliding his phone across the table. The screen unlocked, the damning thread of messages glowing under the soft lamplight. I said nothing, not a word, because I wanted the silence to do the work, wanted the weight of his own words to hang in the air like smoke he could not wave away. His face drained of colour, the blood rushing out as if the truth had struck him physically, his eyes darting from the screen to me and back again. I did not flinch, not once, though my heart thundered so loud it seemed impossible he could not hear it. For the first time, I held the power, and it wrapped around me like armor. He stammered at first, tried to laugh it off, said it was just a joke with a friend, nothing serious, but even his voice betrayed him, thin and brittle, like glass under strain. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes never leaving his, and let him sweat, let him grasp for excuses that collapsed in his own mouth. I thought of every night I had smiled while secretly collecting evidence, every morning I had cooked his breakfast while building a case in silence, and I felt no guilt, only the steady rise of something long denied, my own strength standing unshaken in the face of his lies. When he tried to reach for my hand, I pulled it back and folded it in my lap, a simple gesture, but one that cut deeper than words. He saw then what I already knew, that the performance was over, that the audience had left, and that the only future waiting for him now was the ruin he had built for himself. The moment the mask finally slipped away, Leonard erupted like a man cornered, his voice rising with the fury of someone who had built his power on control and could not stomach losing it. He slammed his fist against the table, sending the wine sloshing over the rim of his glass, his face red with rage as he hurled accusations at me, calling me ungrateful, paranoid, vindictive, insisting that I had invaded his privacy and twisted his words into poison. He shouted that the messages were jokes, that I had no sense of humour, that men spoke to each other differently than they did to women. But the more he spoke, the more hollow it rang, like a drum with nothing inside. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, refusing to give him the reaction he craved, and the silence unsettled him more than any shouting could have. I felt no need to match his volume, no need to justify myself, because the truth glowed brightly between us on the screen he could not deny. When he demanded to know what I wanted, when he sneered that I was nothing without him, I met his eyes and said in a voice calm and clear, "Your future is gone." The words seemed to strike him harder than anything else, stealing the fight from his chest for one brief second before pride rushed back to fill the gap. He called me a fool, said I would regret this, that no one would ever love me again, and then he grabbed his coat from the back of the chair, the fabric catching on the wood as he yanked it loose with a curse. I stood and followed him to the door, my steps steady, my heart strangely quiet in the wake of his storm. He stormed out into the night, muttering threats under his breath, But I no longer feared him, no longer felt the chill of his shadow stretching over me. I closed the door behind him, turned the lock with deliberate care, and leaned my forehead against the wood for a moment, breathing in the silence that was mine again. The house was still, the air heavy with the scent of extinguished candles and spilt wine. But beneath it all, I felt something break open inside me. Not despair, but relief. The first clean breath of freedom after too many nights of suffocation. When I first decided to share my story, my knees trembled as though I was standing on a cliff's edge, about to leap into the unknown, and I questioned whether silence might still be safer, whether keeping the truth tucked away might spare me the shame of pitying glances. But something stronger than fear pushed me forward. The steady insistence that what Leonard had done to me was not just mine to bear, that it lived inside the shadows of many women's lives, unspoken but ever present. So one evening at the church hall, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of coffee brewing in the corner, I stood before the women I had prayed with for years, women who knew me as the quiet one, the steady one, the one who baked bread for fundraisers and asked little of anyone. My voice shook as I began, the words stumbling out like a confession, telling them how Leonard had courted me with promises of forever while secretly reducing me to numbers on a ledger, mocking me behind my back, treating my life's work as spoils waiting to be claimed. For a moment, the room was silent, and I thought perhaps I had made a mistake, that my story would be met with polite discomfort or disbelief. But then I saw tears welling in the eyes of Margaret, whose husband had drained her retirement before leaving, and I saw Ruth's hand rise to her mouth, as she whispered that she too had once been called a burden, while her bank account was emptied in the name of love. The silence cracked open into nods, murmurs of recognition, and then applause. Not the applause of performance, but the raw sound of solidarity, palms striking together as though to say, "We see you, we hear you, we believe you." Some women came forward with their own confessions, stories of manipulation and quiet thefts that mirrored my own, and others simply embraced me, holding me as if my strength was now theirs too. I felt the weight I had carried for months lift, not because Leonard's betrayal hurt any less, but because for the first time, I knew I was not standing alone in the fight. In that hall, under the warm light and the voices rising around me, I found a new kind of family, bound not by blood or vows, but by the fierce truth that none of us would ever be silent again. Walking into the courthouse that morning felt like stepping onto a battlefield I had once sworn I would never have the strength to face. Yet there I was, with my old friend Elaine by my side, her steady presence reminding me that I was no longer the timid woman Leonard believed he could manipulate. The walls smelled faintly of dust and polish, the kind of place where lives are reduced to folders and evidence, where truth and lies are sorted not by emotion, but by the sharp cut of law. Elaine had prepared every document, every screenshot, every bank statement I had collected in silence, and as she laid them before the clerk, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the way a storm sometimes brings stillness just before it breaks. The messages Leonard had written, the words that mocked me and counted my savings like coins in his pocket, became more than insults now. They became evidence of intent, the undeniable proof that his plans had not been about love, but about theft. When the records were filed, when his name appeared on official papers accusing him of attempted fraud, I imagined him sitting in his tidy kitchen rehearsing excuses, never expecting that the woman he called Easy Money would one day be the one to expose him. Soon the whispers began to spread, not whispers of admiration for the generous widower who brought wine to gatherings and charmed with his practiced stories, but whispers of disgrace, of greed, of cruelty. His reputation, once polished and gleaming, began to tarnish in the eyes of neighbors and acquaintances who had once applauded him. People shook their heads at the hypocrisy, at the man who spoke of love but wrote messages that revealed contempt. And I watched from a distance as the pedestal he had built for himself cracked beneath him. It was not revenge that pulsed in me as the case moved forward, but justice, the long-delayed recognition that my voice, my records, my determination had power. I thought of the years I had taught my children to stand tall, to never let anyone reduce them to less than their worth. And I realized I was finally teaching myself the same lesson. Filing that case was more than a legal strike. It was a reclamation of dignity, the declaration that I would no longer be measured in silence, but in the strength of my truth. I did not need to raise my voice or chase him through the streets with accusations because the truth had already taken root. And once planted, it spread quickly, winding its way into every corner of his carefully polished life, until there was no space left untouched. Leonard tried to twist the story, of course, weaving himself into the role of the wronged man, telling anyone who would listen that I was vindictive, bitter, still broken from my first marriage, that I had invented my claims to punish him for daring to love again. But whispers travel faster than speeches, and the very same people he once courted with charm began to murmur in corners about the records, the messages, the evidence filed neatly in court that carried more weight than his red-faced denials. Invitations that had once come weekly to barbecues, luncheons, and charity events grew scarce, and I heard through others that when he did appear, people watched him with suspicion, their smiles brittle, their laughter forced, as though his presence left a sour taste. Even his adult children, once eager to bask in the glow of their father's generous image, began to pull back, unwilling to tether themselves to the growing shadow of scandal. I imagined him sitting at his own table, the phone silent, the mailbox empty, the walls echoing with a loneliness he had once thought was only mine to endure. And through it all, I remained still, silent, choosing not to defend myself, not to strike back with barbed words, because the truth had already spoken for me, and its voice carried farther than mine ever could. There was a strange satisfaction in restraint, in knowing that every denial he gave only deepened his ruin, that the harder he tried to erase what was written, the more indelible it became. I carried on with my life quietly, walking through the market, attending church, speaking kindly to neighbors, and letting my composure be the mirror of his unraveling. It was not revenge I tasted in those days, but vindication. The sweet knowledge that his downfall came not from my anger, but from his own hands, his own greed, his own words. And as his once polished image shattered into pieces no one could piece back together, I finally understood that silence, when paired with truth, can be the loudest voice of all. The first hammer strike against the old wall felt like the sound of my life breaking open. Not in destruction, but in renewal, as if each crack and crumble were peeling away the remnants of what Leonard had tried to reduce me to. I poured the funds I had secured, not into extravagant indulgence, but into shaping my home into something alive, a space that would carry the proof of survival and the warmth of solidarity. The rooms that once echoed with my doubts now rang with laughter as I invited women who had endured their own betrayals, their own quiet battles, to sit at my table and find rest. I painted the walls in colors that reminded me of sunrise, soft golds and gentle blues, shades that whispered of beginnings rather than endings. I built a reading nook by the window where light streamed in, and I stocked it with books donated by neighbors and friends. Volumes that spoke of courage, resilience, and faith in the face of betrayal. The spare room became a sanctuary for women who needed a place to stay while they gathered their strength, a safe bed beneath a quilt stitched with patience and care. Each nail I drove into the wall, each brushstroke of paint, felt like stitching myself back together, proof that broken things could be remade more beautiful than before. When it was finished, when the last picture was hung and the last floor polished, I stood in the center of the living room and lifted a small wooden sign onto the wall. The words were simple but fierce, carved deep as if to make them permanent. The future belongs to me. I traced the letters with my fingers and felt tears gather, not from grief, but from gratitude that I had lived to claim those words as my own. For too long, my future had been bartered away in someone else's plans, diminished by his calculations. But now, it stretched before me like an open road, wide and sunlit. Women who came through my door saw that sign and smiled, some with tears in their eyes, because they understood that it was not just mine. It was theirs too, a declaration for anyone who had been told they were nothing more than easy money or a burden to bear. In that space, we found strength together, and I finally found peace. I have often thought about how a single phrase can be both a promise and a prison. How Leonard once called me his future, as if the word itself were a gift only he could bestow, when in truth it was nothing but a net he meant to cast around me. For a long time, I carried the shame of that discovery, the sting of being mocked, the realization that I had poured my heart into someone who only measured me in dollars and cents. But I see now that I was not destroyed by his betrayal. I was remade in its fire. Pain has a way of burning away illusions, leaving behind only what is unbreakable. And in those ashes, I found myself standing taller than I had in years, steadier than I ever believed I could be. I was not easy money. I was not a fool. I was a woman who loved openly and trusted fully. And when that trust was broken, I refused to let it turn me bitter or small. Instead, I chose to build, to invest, not in him, not in some imagined forever, but in myself, in my home, in the women who walk through my door and see proof that survival can blossom into something radiant. Leonard thought he could define me, but it is I who now write the terms of my own life. I who carved those words into wood and hung them high where no shadow can reach them, a reminder that the future belongs to me. When I look back, I do not see a victim. I see a woman who carried her scars like a map, leading her to a place she would never have found otherwise, a place where her voice matters, and her choices ripple outward in ways she may never fully measure. If you are listening, if you have ever been made to feel less than, if you have ever been treated as a possession or a means to an end, let my story remind you that you are not defined by the harm done to you, but by the strength you summon after it. I was called his future, but I reclaimed my life as my own investment, my own story, my own legacy, and that, more than anything, is the truest victory.